The phantom case settled over Texarkana in the soft dark of 1946, and tonight we sit with the old file as though the paper itself still carries a little road dust. Settle in and let the pace be slow. There's no rush here, because the case was patient, and the people who kept returning to it had to learn patience too. You can imagine the folder on the desk before you, not clean and new, but softened at the corners from many hands. The ink has faded toward brown. The photographs have that dull grey sheen old police photographs sometimes have, as if the light has been pressed flat inside them. Somewhere beyond the window, in your mind, a train moves through Texarkana, crossing that borderline between Texas and Arkansas with a low, steady sound, while you turn the first page of the phantom case and let the town come back slowly. Texarkana was never one place in the simple way a name can suggest. The sounds of a post-war town settling back into ordinary life. You hear tires over damp pavement, screen doors easing shut, late radios murmuring through kitchen windows, and young people driving out past the last bright stores into the dark edges of town. If you sit with the map long enough, you begin to notice the roads first, those narrow country lanes and quiet turnoffs where the city thinned into fields. The phantom case began there, not as a legend, and not as a headline, but as a report that moved across a desk. On the night of the 22nd of February, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Laurie had driven to a quiet place outside town. They were young, and the hour was late, and the world around them would have smelled of winter grass, cool soil, car upholstery, and the faint metal scent of a dashboard warmed all day and cooling after sunset. When you read their names now, you read them gently, because they were not symbols in a mystery. They were people who lived through something they would have to describe, again and again, to men with notebooks. Their account gave the investigation its first shape. A man appeared in the darkness, his face covered, carrying a light and a weapon, and the details came to the officers in fragments, as details often do after fear has passed through a room. You can almost hear the pencil moving over paper, pausing where a witness hesitates, then scratching onward as the detective tries to preserve the words without forcing them into certainty. The description was strange, but it was also humanly uncertain, the kind of memory that arrives with sharp edges in one place and fog in another. That is one reason detectives could never crack the phantom case with the confidence they needed. From the beginning, they were working with something both vivid and incomplete. You can hold that contradiction in your hands like a thin carbon copy. There was a masked man, according to the survivors. There was a flashlight. There was an isolated road. There were voices, movements, impressions, and then the long business of trying to turn those impressions into a person with a name. In those days, a case file did not speak the way modern evidence sometimes speaks. There was no database quietly comparing traces across state lines. No genetic profile waited in a laboratory freezer. Fingerprints could help if there were prints to lift and if they matched someone already known. Tire marks could be measured. Shell casings could be examined. Witness statements could be compared under bright office light. But so much depended on people, on memory, on handwriting, on telephone calls, on a deputy's instinct, on whether a neighbor had heard a car at the right hour. As you sit beside that small lamp, you can feel how narrow the tools were. The paper is dry beneath your fingers. The old report has a faint dust smell. A police office at night might have held the odor of coffee, tobacco, floor wax, and damp wool coats hanging near the door. Somewhere in that room a telephone would ring, and every ring could be a lead, a rumor, a confession, or nothing at all. The first surviving witnesses gave investigators a beginning, but not an ending. You turn the page slowly, and the next date waits there with the quiet patience of old ink. By the 24th of March, the phantom case had moved from one report into something heavier, and Texarkana began to understand that the first night had not been an isolated shadow. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found near a quiet stretch off US Highway 67, west of town, and the officers who came to the scene had to do the plain, careful work that detectives do when shock would not help anyone. They looked at the car, they looked at the ground, they noted what could be noted, and they carried the rest back into offices, where daylight made everything look both clearer and sadder. You can picture the morning light on the road, pale and ordinary, with grass wet against shoe leather and dust clinging to trouser cuffs. A passing motorist had seen the parked car, and that simple act of noticing became part of the record. In cold cases, small observations matter because they are often all the file has to offer. A car placed here, a road leading there. A time estimated by someone who had no reason to remember the morning until the morning became important. The names Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore belong in the telling with care. He was 29. She was 17. They had been seeing each other only a short time, and when you read that in the file, it gives the page a tender, ordinary weight. 6 weeks can be almost nothing in a ledger, but to young people it can feel full of promise, full of small conversations and glances and plans that have no reason yet to become serious. Detectives had to move from that human softness into procedure. They questioned people who had been nearby. They followed tire marks where they could. They considered who knew the road, who had been out late, who had access to vehicles, who might have been seen with clothing that raised questions. You can hear the slow turn of the investigation, not dramatic, not clean, but methodical. One officer asks, another writes. A sheriff reads a statement twice, then folds it into the growing file. In the Phantom case, the geography mattered almost as much as the witnesses. Texarkana was a border town, and borders can make police work more complicated in small, practical ways. A road might cross from Texas authority into Arkansas authority. A suspect might be seen in one county and sleep in another. City police, county officers, state police, and later outside investigators all had their own jurisdictions, their own habits, their own paper systems. You can feel the weight of coordination in that, the way a message had to travel by telephone, by car, by teletype, or by a man carrying a note. The tools of 1946 were not careless tools, they were simply limited. Officers could compare bullets and casings, they could examine clothing, they could track stolen cars. They could interview hundreds of people and test each answer against the clock. But they could not make a partial memory become exact. They could not ask a computer to gather patterns from 1,000 old records in a blink. They had to build understanding the slow way, from paper, shoe leather, and repetition. You return to the folder and notice how quickly the investigation widened. People were questioned. Tips arrived. Some sounded promising at first, then thinned out under scrutiny. Others were confused from the beginning, offered by frightened citizens who wanted to help or wanted to believe the answer had already appeared. The room would have filled with voices, clerks taking calls, officers comparing notes, reporters waiting outside, family members hoping for something that could be said plainly. This is where patient detective work becomes almost invisible. The public remembers the headline, but the case file remembers the waiting. It remembers the man who drove a county road twice because the first pass bothered him. It remembers the woman who called after supper because she thought she had seen a car weeks before. It remembers the detective who stayed late, rubbing tired eyes, reading the same statement again for a small inconsistency that might not mean anything. In the Phantom case, too many things almost meant something. A mark on the ground, a description of a man, a report of a suspicious stranger, a person with an uneasy alibi. But a criminal case needs more than unease. It needs evidence that can stand upright when challenged, and the detectives of Texarkana were trying to build that kind of evidence out of nights, roads, and frightened memory. There is a special kind of quiet in an investigation when everyone is working and no answer comes. You can feel it as you sit with the page. The lamplight warms one edge of the file. The rest of the room stays cool. Outside, in the imagined distance, dogs bark once and settle. The detectives keep moving because stopping would feel like leaving the victims behind, and no decent investigator wants to do that. But there was one more date coming toward Texarkana, and when it arrived, the Phantom name would settle more firmly over the case. On the 14th of April, the Phantom case entered another part of the town's memory, and you can sense the file growing thicker under your hand. Betty Jo Booker had played saxophone that night with her band, and Paul Martin was with her afterward. Their names bring a different texture into the room, because music leaves traces in a story. You can almost hear a reed instrument being packed into its case, the soft click of latches, the tired voices after a performance, and the scrape of chairs on a floor that still holds the warmth of an evening crowd. They were young too. Betty Jo was known as bright and talented, and Paul was part of that same ordinary world of school, friends, cars, late rides, and families expecting people home. When you read about them, you do not need the story to lean toward darkness. It is enough to sit with the plain fact that they had lives in motion. That is what investigators saw behind the reports. Not just another incident, but another set of parents, another circle of friends, another set of questions placed gently but heavily on a town already listening for every sound after dusk. Their case brought a missing saxophone into the investigation, and that detail remained in the file like an object set on a table. A saxophone is not an abstract clue. It has weight. It has cold keys that warm under fingers. It smells faintly of brass, cork grease, and a lined case. You can imagine detectives asking after it in music shops, pawn shops, buses, hotel rooms, and any place where an instrument might be noticed by someone who knew its shape. For a while, the missing saxophone offered a kind of hope. If someone tried to sell it, perhaps the case would take on a face. If it turned up in a room, perhaps it would pull a suspect into reach. Detectives often live with this kind of hope, not the loud kind, but the practical kind that says one object may still travel where the truth cannot. So they asked, they watched, they listened. They followed reports that came in from other towns. One man in Corpus Christi drew attention when a story about a saxophone reached officers, and for a short time the line seemed worth following. You can picture the telegrams and calls, the officers leaning over desks, the impatience held carefully in check. But the lead did not hold. The man was questioned and cleared. The object had not brought them the answer. In time, Betty Jo's saxophone was found in underbrush near the area connected to the case, and by then it was less a key than a reminder of how often clues return without explaining themselves. This is another reason detectives could never crack the phantom case. Some evidence was real, but not decisive. Some leads were reasonable, but not strong enough. Some facts belonged to the case without pointing clearly to the person behind it. You can set the saxophone in your mind beside the witness descriptions and the road maps, and you can see how an investigation may be full of details while still lacking the one detail that opens the door. By mid-April, the press had begun using the name that would outlast almost everything else: the Phantom. A word like that can help a frightened public speak about what it fears, but it can also blur the human edges of an investigation. You and I can be careful with it tonight. We can use the name because the case uses it, but we do not have to let it turn the unknown man into a myth larger than the people whose lives were changed. The name appeared in newspapers as officers pressed the investigation, and from there it spread through conversation. At kitchen tables, at filling stations, in barber chairs, in churchyards, people said the word and looked toward the roads. The paper itself would have had a dry ink smell when folded at breakfast. Radios would have hummed with updates. Store doors opened and shut as residents came in for locks, ammunition, shades, and anything that made a house feel more secure after sunset. You can sit with that town feeling without making it loud. Fear can be porch light left on. It can be a father checking a window latch twice. It can be a mother asking someone to call when they arrive. It can be young people staying closer to town or going out anyway because youth often believes that ordinary life should continue. For detectives, public fear created more work. Every rumor had to be weighed. Every reported stranger had to be considered. Every false confession had to be tested against facts that officers kept back from the papers. You can almost feel the paper stack rising, page by page, until the file becomes not only a record of crimes, but a record of a town trying to understand itself under pressure. And still the investigators return to the same basic questions. Who knew the roads? Who had been out on those nights? Who owned or borrowed a car? Who had a weapon of the relevant kind? Who had been absent from home at the wrong time, or too eager to talk, or too silent when everyone else had something to say? Those questions are simple when spoken, but they become enormous when applied to hundreds of people. The Phantom case was not starved of attention. That matters. It was not ignored in those spring weeks. Local officers worked it. County sheriffs worked it. Texas Rangers became involved. Arkansas authorities had their part. The Federal Bureau of Investigation offered assistance in limited ways, as federal agencies often did when local cases drew wider concern. There were many badges near the file, many hands on the pages, but attention is not the same as proof. You can linger there, because it is the heart of many unsolved cases. A case can be investigated seriously and still remain unresolved. People can care deeply and still be unable to cross the last distance. Detectives are not magicians. They are workers inside the limits of evidence, time, memory, law, and the plain bad luck of what was not seen. Years later, people would still ask why the phantom was never named in court, and the answer begins with those limits, gathered quietly from the first weeks of 1946. When May came, the phantom case crossed from the lovers' lanes into a home, and the change unsettled Texarkana in a different way. On the 3rd of May, Virgil Starks and his wife Katie were at their farmhouse in Miller County, Arkansas. The evening had the kind of domestic stillness a person can picture without effort. A chair, a newspaper, a window, the familiar surfaces of a room known by touch, where the air might carry the scent of wood, supper, lamp heat, and spring earth cooling outside. We will stay gentle here, because Katie Starks lived through the night and had to carry it afterward. The important part for our quiet review is not the harshness of what happened, but the investigative difficulty it created. This attack was different in setting. It happened at a home, not a parked car on a secluded road. It used a different kind of circumstance. It raised the question every detective dislikes, because it opens too many paths at once. Was this the same person changing his pattern, or was it a separate crime being pulled into the phantom case by timing and fear? You can imagine the officers arriving at the Starks' home, their shoes on the floorboards, their voices low, the night air moving through broken glass. They would have studied angles, distances, windows, and the surrounding yard. They would have asked what had been taken, if anything. They would have asked what Katie heard, what she saw, what she remembered before pain and confusion overtook the ordinary order of the evening. Katie survived, and her survival mattered. She gave what she could. She moved through medical care, questioning, recovery, and the long private aftermath that no case file can fully contain. When you read her name, you may pause. A survivor's statement can become evidence, but a survivor is never only evidence. She is a person who had to go on living in a town where everyone wanted answers from the same night she was trying to endure. The Starks attack deepened the investigation but also complicated it. The weapon evidence did not fit neatly with every earlier assumption. Some officers questioned whether the same person was responsible. Others saw enough similarity in the timing, the region, and the public pattern to keep the case within the larger phantom discussion. In a modern retelling, people sometimes smooth these uncertainties away. But when you sit with the file, you should let them remain uneven. Unevenness is honest. It is what old investigations often feel like. The paper does not lie neatly on the desk. One report leans against another. One witness says east, another says west. One officer believes a connection is obvious, while another wants more proof before linking separate lives under one name. You turn the pages and feel the slight resistance of old staples, the kind that rust at the corners and leave orange marks on the paper. The town's fear rose after the Starks' attack because a house no longer felt as separate from the mystery. People began to secure their homes more carefully. Stores sold protective items quickly. Officers patrolled streets and country roads. The soundscape of Texarkana changed after dark. Tires rolled slower. Radios stayed on. A porch board creaked and someone inside listened before answering the door. For detectives, this meant more calls. More rumors, more pressure. Pressure can help a case by bringing witnesses forward, but it can also bury investigators under noise. Every citizen wanted the police to know what they had seen. Every family had a theory. Every strange car became a possible lead. Every man who looked unfamiliar could be whispered into suspicion. You can feel how difficult that must have been. A detective cannot ignore fear, because fear sometimes carries a true observation inside it. But he cannot accept fear as evidence either. He has to stand in the middle, patient and tired, sorting the useful from the imagined while the town waits for a sentence he cannot yet speak. That spring, officers investigated hundreds of suspects and checked many leads. Some people were detained and released. Some stories collapsed under simple questioning. Some confessions came from people who could not have known the hidden facts, or who placed themselves in the wrong place, or whose words carried more need than truth. False confessions are their own quiet burden in a case like this. They take time, and they also show how a public mystery can draw troubled people toward its center. You and I can sit with the detectives here, not as judges above them, but as people beside the desk, understanding the limits of the hour. They had no clean forensic path. They had no single eyewitness who could identify a face. They had a masked description, uncertain connections between incidents, public panic, and a suspect pool that widened faster than it narrowed. The Phantom case was becoming famous, and fame can make a case harder to hear. When the next box came down from the shelf, it was not only the crime reports inside, but the rumors that had gathered around them like dust. Rumor became one of the quiet adversaries in the Phantom case, and you can see it drifting through Texarkana almost like weather. It moved through grocery lines, filling stations, church steps, newspaper offices, and late-night calls to police desks. Someone had been arrested, someone had confessed, someone was hidden in a jail under another name, someone had seen a masked man by the road, someone's cousin knew a deputy who knew the truth. You can place yourself at the detective's desk when the telephone rings again. The receiver is black and heavy. The cord twists under your fingers. On the other end, a voice speaks quickly, not always calmly, and you try to hear whether there is a fact inside the fear. You write down the name, the time, the place, the car color, the direction of travel. Then you hang up, and the room seems to hold the echo of that voice for a few seconds before the next call comes. Texas Ranger Captain Manuel Gonzalez, known widely as Lone Wolf Gonzalez, came into the public memory of the case as one of the visible figures of the investigation. He was experienced, direct, and comfortable with reporters in a way some local officers were not. Yet even a famous ranger could not turn rumor into proof. He could warn the public that rumors harmed the investigation. He could ask people to bring facts, not whispers, but he could not keep fear from multiplying in the dark. You can imagine the press conference room, warm with bodies and cigarette smoke, papers rustling, flashbulbs startling the air for a second and then leaving everyone blinking. Reporters needed updates. Citizens needed reassurance. Officers needed space to work. Those needs did not always fit together neatly. A newspaper could inform the town, but it could also feed the size of the Phantom name. A headline could steady people, or it could make the unknown feel larger than the evidence. The word Phantom did something curious to the case. It gave the public a figure, but that figure had no face. Detectives needed the opposite. They needed less atmosphere and more detail, less legend and more laundry receipts, road times, vehicle descriptions, weapon access, witness contradictions, and ordinary habits. They were trying to reduce a frightening name back down to a man who bought gasoline somewhere, slept somewhere, spoke to someone, and made mistakes somewhere. That is often how patient detective work feels. It is not chasing a shadow through fog. It is waiting for the shadow to become paperwork. You look for the rental record, the traffic stop, the pawn ticket, the neighbor's memory, the timeline that cannot stretch far enough to protect a suspect's story. In Texarkana, officers looked for those ordinary anchors, but the Phantom case kept slipping away from the kind of proof a prosecutor could hold. The public did not always understand that distinction. To a frightened town, suspicion can feel close to certainty. To a court, it is not close at all. Detectives might believe they knew who had done something and still lack the evidence to charge that person responsibly. They might hear a story that feels true and still be unable to use it if the witness will not testify. They might see a pattern and still know that pattern alone cannot carry the whole weight. You can rest with that thought for a moment, because it matters in this case. The question is not only why detectives could never find a suspect. At times, they did find people who interested them deeply. The harder question is why interest never became a solved case. Why the bridge from suspicion to proof never held. Why the file stayed open even after names were written on many pages. As spring moved towards summer, the immediate attacks stopped, and that silence created its own uncertainty. A stopped pattern can mean many things. A person has left town, a person has been jailed for something else, a person has died, a person has chosen to stop, or the pattern was never as unified as it seemed. Detectives had to consider all of that without letting any one answer become too comfortable. In a quieter town, after the first wave of fear eased, the case remained on desks and in minds. You can see the office after midnight, when the calls have slowed and only the lamplight remains. The file is still there. The names are still there. The roads are still on the map. And the unknown person at the center of the phantom case has not become clearer, only quieter. But behind the public rumors, another part of the investigation was taking shape, and it would lead toward the suspect most often remembered in the case. That suspect was Ewell Swinney, and when you see his name in the phantom case, it does not arrive like an answer written neatly at the bottom of a page. It arrives in pieces, through stolen cars, statements, suspicions, and a marriage that placed one witness very close to what detectives wanted to know. You can almost feel the paper change texture here, from the broad, frightened reports of a town under pressure to the narrower records of one man whose life already passed through police files. Swinney was not a stranger to law enforcement. He had a record, and he knew the small practical world of theft, evasion, and aliases better than an ordinary person would. Detectives looking back over the phantom case saw in him something that interested them, not because interest proves guilt, but because his movements and habits seemed to touch the edges of the mystery. You turn the page and notice how cautious the language becomes, how often the file seems to lean forward without quite standing up. The arrest that brought him into sharper view was connected to car theft, not to the phantom killings directly. That detail matters, because old cases often turn on nearby crimes, the kind that seem smaller at first but open doors into larger questions. A stolen vehicle can place a person in a town. A registration number can travel farther than memory. A suspect may be careless about one offense while guarding another more carefully. Detectives know this, and so they read even minor records with patience. You can imagine the desk where Swinney's name was underlined. The room might have smelled of pencil shavings, carbon paper, and warm dust in the blinds. A detective would compare dates with a ruler or the edge of a hand, moving back and forth between the phantom case timeline and Swinney's known movements. There is something almost domestic about that kind of work, despite the seriousness beneath it. A man bends over a table, the light yellow around him, trying to make dates speak. The strongest interest came through Swinney's wife, Peggy, whose statements reportedly pointed toward him in a way investigators could not ignore. She was young, and her words carried the weight of a person entangled in another person's life, with fear, loyalty, pressure, memory, and self-preservation all moving through the same narrow hallway. You can sit with that carefully. A spouse's statement can sound like a door opening, but in the law, doors often have locks you cannot simply push through. At that time, marital privilege and the rules surrounding spousal testimony created serious problems for prosecutors. The details vary in retellings, but the central difficulty remains simple enough to understand. Peggy Swinney could tell investigators things, yet getting those things into court, cleanly and reliably, was another matter. Detectives might hear something that made them sit very still. A prosecutor might still have to say, quietly, that it was not enough. This is one of the places where the phantom case becomes especially human. You can feel the frustration without needing it to become dramatic. Imagine an officer who has worked the roads, taken the calls, seen families waiting, and now has a suspect whose name keeps returning to the file. He may feel the case turning toward an answer. Then he meets the hard wall of admissible evidence, and the file stays open on the desk. It is important to remember that investigators did not need only a private belief. They needed something that could survive a courtroom. A confession from one person about another person is not the same as physical evidence. A spouse's statement, shaped by a complicated home life, may be powerful and still fragile. A timeline may suggest, a record may support, but a jury would need a chain of proof that did not break when touched. You can almost hear the legal language entering the room like cooler air. Probable cause. corroboration, competency, privilege, admissibility. These are dry words, but they carry moral weight, because they protect people from being convicted by suspicion alone. In the Phantom case, those protections meant that even a deeply interesting suspect could remain outside the final reach of prosecution. Swinney's wife was not the only part of the suspicion. There were reports about property, behavior, and possible connections to the knights in question. Some accounts say investigators believed he knew details that had not been widely published. Other retellings place emphasis on his pattern of crime and his familiarity with travel around the region. Yet when you sit quietly with these claims, you notice that many arrive filtered through memory, later interviews, and case law shaped over many decades. That is another difficulty in old mysteries. The file and the legend begin to grow together, like two papers left in a damp drawer. They adhere at the edges. Later writers separate them as carefully as they can, but sometimes a fiber comes away. You and I can move slowly here, not because the detail is unimportant, but because the most honest way to hold this case is with a light grip. Swinney was eventually convicted on other charges and spent time in prison, while the Phantom case itself remained unresolved. That fact has always hovered near the story. If he was responsible, confinement may have ended the attacks. If he was not, the ending of the attacks must be explained some other way. Detectives faced that same fork in the road. A pattern stopped after a suspect was jailed, and that can feel meaningful. But feeling meaningful is not the same as proving meaning. You turn that idea over like a small object in your palm. The room is quiet. The paper smells old. Somewhere in the imagined police building, a typewriter begins again, each key striking with soft metallic certainty. A typed report can look official and complete, but inside the neat lines there may still be doubt. And doubt was one thing the Phantom case never ran out of. When detectives looked at Swinney, they were looking not only for whether he could have done it, but for whether they could show it beyond reasonable doubt. Those are different questions. One belongs to investigation. The other belongs to judgment. Many cold cases live between them for years, with names circled in old notebooks and no indictment that can carry the full weight of a public answer. You can sit beside that boundary for a while. It is a narrow boundary, but it is necessary. The detectives may have felt they were standing near the truth, yet the truth, if it cannot be demonstrated, remains a private conviction rather than a solved case. Families do not get the same peace from private conviction. Towns do not get it either. They get rumors, and rumors keep moving. The Phantom case therefore kept both things at once, a prime suspect in many minds, and no official solution. It is not a contradiction so much as a condition of the evidence. You can imagine a later investigator opening the same folder years afterward, reading the name U.L. Swinney, reading Peggy's statements, reading the notes about obstacles, and feeling the old frustration rise in a quieter form. Not anger now, perhaps, more like a sigh in an archive room. The archive room is cold in the morning. The metal shelves hold more boxes than one person could read in a week. Some labels are typed, some are handwritten. The cardboard has softened in the humidity, and when you pull one box down, the lid resists for a moment before loosening. Inside, the Phantom case is not a story. It is paper, envelopes, photographs, clippings, and the smell of time. You sit with the Swinney material and see why detectives kept returning to it. There is enough there to hold attention. There is not enough there to close the door. That is the long discomfort of the case. It did not fail because no one cared. It remained unsolved because caring could not replace the missing piece, the hard evidence or admissible statement that would allow a courtroom to say what newspapers had been wondering for months. Years later, another kind of patience would enter the Phantom case, as old witnesses aged, old officers retired, and the file moved from active urgency into historical uncertainty. Time changes the texture of every investigation, and in the Phantom case, time did not simply pass, it settled. It settled into newspaper archives, family recollections, police storage, local memory, and the uneasy space between certainty and proof. You can picture Texarkana years after 1946, with the same streets, under different cars. the same state line beneath newer signs, and people still remembering where they were when the town locked its doors early. For the first investigators, the case was immediate. For later investigators, it became inherited. That changes the work. A detective reopening the Phantom case decades later could not walk into the same barbershop and find every voice still waiting. He could not ask a young witness to return to a roadside memory with fresh detail. He had to work with what had been preserved, and with what time had left behind. You open a later folder and find the evidence of age everywhere. Names have new addresses beside them, or no address at all. A witness who once spoke from the front porch is now listed in an obituary clipping. A detective's original note may survive only as a copy, thin and pale, with the words fading near the fold. The paper feels fragile enough that you turn it slowly, as though the case might lose something if handled too quickly. Memory itself becomes part of the investigation. People remember old fear clearly, but fear is not always exact. A man may remember the police car outside his neighbor's house, but not the date. A woman may remember hearing her parents whisper about a suspect, but not whether the name came from a newspaper or from a deputy. You learn, as the quiet detective tonight, to respect memory without surrendering to it. In cold case work, respect and skepticism have to sit in the same chair. You listen. You thank the witness. You write carefully. Then you compare the memory against documents that may be incomplete themselves. It is slow work, and sometimes it feels almost unfair, because the person speaking may be offering the last living trace of something important, and still, you cannot treat that trace as certainty. The Phantom case became part of Texarkana's local identity in a way few investigations do. Books were written, films borrowed from the events. Residents told stories that had been told to them, and those stories changed slightly with each telling, softened in one place and sharpened in another. You can hear the difference between an official report and a local story. The report is dry. The story has breath in it. Both may carry truth, but not always the same kind. For detectives, the growth of legend made the old file harder to clear. A famous case collects inventions the way a coat collects lint. A detail from one incident drifts into another. A suspect from one rumor becomes a certainty in someone's family memory. A description gets repeated until its repetition feels like proof. You sit at the desk, and your job is to brush away what does not belong without brushing away something real. This is patient work at its most modest. It is not about a sudden revelation. It is about reading the same paragraph 3 times and noticing that a phrase has been added in a later account. It is about checking whether a name was spelled 2 ways because of a clerical error or because 2 different people were involved. It is about following a county road on an old map, then comparing it with the modern road that carries a different number. There is a quiet sensory pleasure in that kind of work, even when the subject is heavy. The old maps unfold with a papery crackle. The pencil leaves a soft grey line near a creek bed. A microfilm reader hums under fluorescent light, and the newspaper page swims into focus after a few careful turns. Your hands smell faintly of dust and machine oil. The past is never as clean as a new screen suggests. The Phantom case asks you to notice how often uncertainty comes from ordinary loss. A report is misplaced. A photograph is copied too many times. A witness moves away. A detective dies, and with him goes the tone of a conversation never written down. An evidence item, if it was kept, may no longer be suitable for modern testing. The world does not preserve every answer just because later people need it. Modern cold case techniques changed what investigators could hope for in many old cases. DNA testing, improved ballistics comparison, digital databases, and wider information sharing solved crimes that once seemed permanently fixed in silence. You can imagine later generations looking back at the Phantom case and wondering whether science might finally do what interviews could not. That hope is understandable, and sometimes, in other cases, it has been justified. But every old case offers different materials to the present. Some cases preserve biological evidence in a way that can be tested decades later. Some preserve weapons. Some preserve clothing. Some preserve photographs and paper, but little else. The Phantom case, as it has been described across the years, has not yielded the kind of clear modern forensic path that could quietly identify someone after all this time. There may be records, there may be memories, there may be theories, but a theory is not a laboratory result. You can feel the difference when you compare the phantom case with cases solved by old DNA. In those stories, the archive contains a sealed item, a trace, a profile waiting for technology to catch up. Then, years later, a lab report arrives with a name or a family line, and the old paper suddenly has a new voice. In Texarkana, the file seems to hold more silence than trace, more testimony than testable material. That does not make the investigation careless, it makes it historical. The detectives of 1946 gathered what they could gather, according to the practices of their time. Later detectives inherited those choices and those limits. You, sitting with the file now, inherit them too. You cannot ask the past to have known what the future would need. The phantom case therefore remains a lesson in preservation as much as detection. A small envelope kept properly can matter more than 1,000 rumors. A note written clearly can save a later investigator from guessing. A scene photographed from one more angle can help someone who was not born when the case began. But these lessons are often learned after the fact, in the quiet regret that follows unsolved work. As you rest with the later years, the town itself becomes softer around the file. The roads are paved differently. The old houses change hands. The people who once lay awake listening for cars become grandparents, then names in genealogies. Yet the case remains near them. It appears in anniversary articles. It returns in conversations. It waits in the background of Texarkana, not always loud but never entirely absent. And through all those years, the central question stayed almost unchanged, whether the answer had once been close enough to touch and still just beyond what the evidence could prove. That question led many people back to the same handful of suspects. And in the phantom case, each name carried its own pattern of uncertainty. You can picture them not as villains in a story, but as entries on a ledger, each one reviewed under lamplight, each one requiring care. A name can be damaged by suspicion. A life can be simplified unfairly by a rumor. The old detectives knew that, and the best later writers know it too. Some suspects were serious enough to investigate. Others were the product of panic, coincidence, or imagination. A man might own a similar car. Another might have been absent from home. Another might have seemed strange to neighbors, which is one of the weakest kinds of evidence and one of the strongest engines of local suspicion. You learn as you turn the pages that strangeness and guilt are not the same. The case also drew confessions, as famous unsolved cases often do. Some people confess for reasons that have little to do with truth. They may seek attention. They may be ill. They may be burdened by unrelated guilt and attach it to a known public mystery. They may want to frighten someone, impress someone, or leave a final message that gives shape to their pain. Detectives cannot dismiss a confession automatically, but they cannot accept it automatically either. One young man, Henry Booker Tennyson, left a note after his death that some connected to the phantom case, but investigators did not accept it as a true solution. You can imagine the difficult tenderness of reviewing such a document. It is already sad before it becomes evidence. A detective has to read the words for facts, not drama, asking whether the writer knew details that had not been published, whether the timing fit, whether the statement explains more than it confuses. In that sense, even false or doubtful confessions become part of the long patience. They must be checked. Officers must compare claims to dates, places, wounds, vehicles, and hidden details. If the claim fails, they have to set it aside, not with cruelty, but with clarity. The file grows thicker, yet the center remains empty. Other names came and went through the phantom investigation, some because of real investigative interest, and others because communities under pressure can become suspicious of anyone who seems near the pattern. You can see why people wanted a name. A name puts a fence around fear. It tells the town where to look and where not to look. But a wrong name does harm, and so detectives had to resist the comfort of premature certainty. That resistance is one of the quiet virtues of patient detective work. It is easier to believe too soon. It is harder to keep asking for proof after everyone is tired of asking. In the Phantom case, the pressure to solve must have been intense. Families wanted justice. Residents wanted safety. Newspapers wanted answers. Officers wanted the same things, but they also had to protect the investigation from being bent by need. You can feel the shape of that pressure in the old clippings. The paper crackles when you turn it. Headlines sit in heavy type. Reporters describe fear in town, patrols on roads, searches, suspects, and official statements. The ink leaves the faintest shadow on your fingertips. Each article is a public moment, but behind it there were private hours, officers driving in silence, witnesses waiting in kitchens, families listening for news. The Phantom case also carried the challenge of linking incidents properly. The first attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larey, the deaths of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, the deaths of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, and the attack on Virgil and Katie Starks are often grouped together under the Phantom name. Yet investigators had to consider differences as well as similarities. That is careful work, and it can be uncomfortable. Pattern recognition helps detectives. It can reveal a person's habits, chosen locations, times, and methods. But pattern recognition can also mislead when fear encourages the mind to connect what may not belong together. You sit with the case map and let the pins remain where they are. You do not force lines between them too quickly. You notice distances, dates, settings, and what each event shares, and what each event does not share. The first reported incident had survivors and a masked description. The next two involved young couples in or near secluded areas. The Starks incident occurred at home. Some weapons evidence and circumstances did not align perfectly in the way a tidy story would prefer. Detectives lived inside that untidiness. They had to ask whether a single offender was adapting, or whether the Phantom label had gathered more than one crime beneath it. There is no shame in asking that question. It is not disrespectful. It is part of honoring the truth. Every victim deserves an investigation into what happened to them, not only into how their story fits a public narrative. You can feel the file asking for that kind of respect. Each name has its own page. Each page has its own weight. The difficulty is that the public memory of a case often prefers unity. One name, one figure, one mystery. But police work has to stay loyal to particulars. The road where one car was found. The time one witness last saw a person alive. The kind of weapon believed to have been used. The weather. The distance from town. The habits of the victims. The habits of the suspect. Small things, separate things, stubborn things. In the Phantom case, those stubborn things never formed a final public answer. They formed a strong suspicion for some, a disputed pattern for others, and a legend for nearly everyone who came later. You can sit with all three without having to choose the most dramatic. Tonight, we are not trying to make the case louder. We are letting it remain as careful and incomplete as the file itself. The years after the main investigation brought quieter forms of review, and each review carried the same hope that one overlooked detail might finally steady the page. When you return to the evidence in the Phantom case, you begin to notice how many different kinds of absence detectives were dealing with. There was the absence of a clear face, the absence of a surviving confession that could stand in court, the absence of decisive physical evidence, the absence of a single jurisdiction that could gather every piece without friction. These absences were not empty spaces. They shaped the whole investigation. A missing face is one of the hardest absences in any case. Mary Jean Larey described a masked man, and that detail became central to the public image of the Phantom. But a mask hides not only identity, it also invites the imagination to work too hard. Witnesses remember height, movement, voice, clothing, and presence, yet each of those can shift under fear, darkness, and time. You can understand why detectives listened closely and still needed more. A missing courtroom confession is another kind of absence. If Peggy Swinney's statements had been usable, consistent, and supported in the ways prosecutors required, the Phantom case might have moved differently. But law does not work in the realm of might have been. It needs procedure. It needs testimony that can be challenged. It needs proof that does not collapse when a defense attorney presses the weak place. You can imagine a prosecutor reading the file, not as a storyteller, but as someone weighing whether every essential fact can be placed before a judge. The office is quiet except for the scratch of a pen. Outside, traffic passes along a Texarkana street, ordinary and indifferent. Inside, one sentence in a statement may look strong, then weaken when compared with another. One lead may shine for an hour, then fade by morning. The absence of decisive physical evidence may be the deepest quiet in the file. Physical evidence can speak across decades, but only if it exists, survives, and connects clearly to the person responsible. In 1946, collecting and preserving evidence followed different expectations. Officers did care about proof, but the science and the storage practices were not what they would become. Some things that modern investigators would seal carefully may have been handled, moved, or never collected at all. This is not a judgment made from a comfortable future. It is simply the truth of time. Every era investigates with the tools it has. You and I can sit in that older office and see the ashtray, the map, the telephone, the report forms, the camera, the evidence envelopes. The men and women working the case were not imagining genetic genealogy, digital ballistics databases, or preservation protocols written for a world decades ahead. The absence created by jurisdiction is quieter, but important. Texarkana's split identity meant law enforcement had to coordinate across city, county, state, and sometimes federal lines. Cooperation did happen, but every added office adds another route a paper must travel. Every route creates delay, duplication, and the possibility of misunderstanding. You can feel that in the practical details: a call placed from one office, a file copied for another, an officer driving across the line to compare notes. Modern listeners sometimes imagine a large, unified investigation moving like one body. The Phantom case was more like several careful hands reaching toward the same box from different sides. They could work together, and often did, but the box remained awkward to lift. The evidence belonged to places. The victims belonged to families. The fear belonged to the whole town. The legal authority did not always rest in one simple place. When a case is active, these complications may be managed by urgency. Everyone is awake, everyone is calling, everyone is pushing. But when years pass, the complications settle into the record. One agency may hold one piece, another may have lost a copy, a third may remember something never written down. Later investigators must walk the same old routes, asking not only what happened, but where the record of what happened has gone. You can imagine opening a drawer and finding nothing where a document should be. Not dramatic nothing, just the flat bottom of a metal file drawer, with dust gathered in the back seam. Perhaps the document was transferred, perhaps it was misfiled, perhaps it was misfiled, perhaps it was misfiled. That pause is part of why the Phantom case remained uncracked. Detectives can only test what remains. They can only compare what was recorded. They can only interview the living. When a case becomes old enough, the investigation is no longer only about the unknown suspect. It is also about the survival of the investigation itself. And still, the people who cared kept returning. Retired officers spoke about the case. Local historians gathered clippings. Families preserved stories. Writers interviewed those who would still talk. You can see them as a loose, quiet procession through the decades. Each person carrying one folder, one memory, one question. None of them alone could solve the Phantom case, but together they kept it from disappearing entirely. That kind of keeping matters, even when it does not produce an arrest. It honors the people whose names are in the file. It says their lives were not only a spring of fear in 1946. It says the questions remain worth holding carefully. In unsolved cases, memory can become a form of service if it stays honest and does not pretend to know more than it knows. You rest your hand on the old folder and feel the slight rise where several pages have been clipped together. There is a quiet dignity in not forcing an answer. There is also sadness in it. The Phantom case sits in that balance, between the need to know and the discipline to admit what cannot be proven. It is a difficult balance, but it may be the only truthful one left. As the years moved on, the town's memory of the Phantom shifted again, from immediate fear into a kind of local inheritance that later generations would approach through archives, films, and family stories. A case can become a story in many ways, and the phantom case became one partly because Texarkana remembered how it felt to live through those weeks. People who were children in 1946 later recalled adults lowering their voices. They recalled doors locked earlier than usual, porch lights glowing longer, and roads avoided after sundown. You can hear that memory softly, not as panic now, but as an old household habit retold across a kitchen table. There is always a risk when a case becomes famous. Fame can preserve, but it can also distort. The Phantom became a name on movie posters, magazine features, and late-night retellings. Some versions leaned into fear, some exaggerated, some flattened the victims into roles. But beneath all of that, the original file remained quieter, and you can return to it whenever the legend becomes too loud. The file reminds you that Texarkana was a real place with ordinary mornings. Milk was delivered. Newspapers landed on porches. Children went to school. Workers crossed the state line without thinking much about it. Spring rain dampened dirt roads. Laundry dried in backyards. In the midst of all that ordinary life, officers were trying to identify one person, or perhaps untangle more than one event, while everyone else tried to sleep. You can picture a later historian sitting with newspaper reels, turning a knob until the page sharpens. The machine gives off a low electric hum. The screen glows pale in a dim room. Headlines from 1946 pass by in reverse, then forward again, until the right date appears. There is a special patience in scrolling through old news, because the answer, if it exists there at all, hides among advertisements, weather notes, wedding announcements, and grocery prices. Old newspapers give the phantom case its public pulse. They show what people were told, when they were told it, and how officials tried to speak without giving away too much. But newspapers also show the limits of public knowledge. Reporters printed what they could gather, and sometimes what officials allowed. They did not have the whole file. They did not know which details were being held back to test confessions. They worked under deadlines, with fear moving faster than ink. You learn to read those papers with care. A phrase like "police believe" may mean one thing in one article and another thing in the next. A suspect mentioned prominently one week may vanish the next because the lead failed. A confident headline may rest on a less confident paragraph below it. You turn the page slowly and let the paper speak in its own time, without asking it to carry more than it can. Family stories carry a different kind of evidence. They preserve feeling, proximity, and the small details official records may miss. A daughter may remember her father cleaning a firearm at the table during those weeks, though he had never done that before. A grandson may remember being told not to park on certain roads. A niece may remember a relative who spoke once about a suspect, then never again. These memories can matter, but they need tenderness and caution. When you listen to a family story, you listen first as a person. The voice may tremble slightly. The room may smell of coffee, old photographs, and furniture polish. A hand may rest on an album page while a name is spoken. Only after that do you listen as a detective, asking when the story began, who first told it, whether the detail appears anywhere else, and what the memory can truly support. The phantom case lives in that overlap between official paper and living memory. One is colder, one is warmer. Neither is complete. The cold paper may preserve a date exactly and miss the way a room felt. The warm memory may preserve the fear perfectly and lose the date entirely. Patient work means letting both stand, then comparing them without contempt. This is why the case continues to draw careful attention. It is not only because the answer is missing, it is because the missing answer reveals how investigations age. It shows how communities remember. It shows how law, evidence, rumor, and grief can all become tangled around a few spring nights in one border town. You and I sit with it tonight, not to untangle everything, but to notice the strands. The question in the title, why detectives could never crack the phantom case, has no single neat answer. It has many quiet answers, layered together. They could not see the attacker's face. They could not transform witness fear into certain identification. They could not make spousal statements into usable proof. They could not stop rumor from widening the field. They could not preserve future signs before future signs existed. And perhaps most painfully, they could not make the case wait for better tools without losing the people who knew it best. Time is both helper and thief in cold cases. It cools fear and allows a calmer review. It also takes witnesses, fades ink, changes roads, and turns living knowledge into second-hand recollection. The phantom case received both gifts and losses from time, and the losses may have been greater. You can feel the archive air again, dry and cool. A ceiling vent rattles faintly. The box lid sits beside your elbow. On the table are clippings, reports, maps, and photocopies made at different times, each one slightly less clear than the original before it. You smooth a page with your palm, and for a moment, the case is not a legend at all. It is just work, still waiting. But, as local memory carried the phantom forward, one detail remained especially important to the question of why proof never arrived: the difference between knowing a suspect and proving a suspect. That difference sits at the center of U.L. Swinney's place in the phantom case, and you can return to it now with slower eyes. Some investigators reportedly considered him the strongest suspect. Some later accounts treat him as the likely answer, yet he was never tried for the phantom crimes, and no court ever placed the official weight of guilt on his name for them. That gap is not small. It is the gap the entire mystery rests inside. Imagine a detective saying, after many years, that he believed he knew who did it. The statement may be sincere. It may be based on more than the public ever saw. It may come from a man who worked the case closely and carried it in his mind long after others moved on. You can respect that. But belief, even informed belief, does not close a case in the legal sense. The file needs more than a respected voice. This can be hard for listeners because stories train us to expect revelation. We want the last page to name the person. We want a confession, a matched fingerprint, a weapon found wrapped in cloth, a letter hidden in a drawer. Real investigations often end more softly and more unsatisfyingly. They end with an officer's conviction, a prosecutor's hesitation, a missing witness, and a file returned to storage. The phantom case seems to have lived there for decades. Swinney remained a name people came back to, but the absence of trial left room for doubt. Peggy Swinney's statements, if reported accurately, were powerful but legally troubled. Physical evidence did not step forward to settle the matter. Swinney's own record made him plausible to some, but plausibility is not proof. The case stayed in the half-light. You can almost see that half-light on the desk. The lamp does not reach the far corner of the room. Papers nearest you are clear, but the ones beyond them are dim. That is how suspicion works in an old case. Some pages seem bright, others fall away. If you move the lamp, a different detail catches your eye, and the whole shape of the case shifts a little. There is another human complication here. Once a suspect becomes the favored answer in public memory, later evidence may be read through that belief. A detail that fits is emphasized. A detail that does not fit may be explained away. That is not because people are dishonest. It is because the mind likes patterns, especially after a long wait. Patient detection requires gently resisting that comfort. You ask as you read, what would need to be true for Swinney to be responsible? Then you ask what would need to be true if he were not. You do not rush either question. If he was the phantom, the case failed at the doorway of proof. If he was not, then suspicion gathered around a man already known to police while the true person disappeared into ordinary life. Both possibilities are unsettling in quiet ways. The legal system is built, at least in principle, to prefer the danger of uncertainty over the danger of an unsupported conviction. That principle can feel cold to families who need answers, but it is part of justice too. You can hold both truths at once. The families deserved clarity. The accused, whoever he was, could not be lawfully condemned without proof. The phantom case pressed those truths against each other and never released them. Detectives in 1946 also had to consider how a defense might answer their case. A defense attorney could challenge witness descriptions from dark roads. He could challenge statements from a spouse. He could ask why physical evidence did not connect cleanly. He could question whether all the incidents were truly linked. A case that seems persuasive in a police office may look less certain when every piece is pulled into court and tested. You can hear the quiet scrape of chairs in a courtroom that never held that trial. Papers are arranged. A judge looks down from the bench. A witness is called. A question is asked twice, more slowly the second time. But in reality, that courtroom scene did not arrive for the phantom case. It remained imaginary, and the untested nature of the evidence became part of the mystery's long afterlife. Swinney himself continued through life under the shadow of suspicion. Later accounts mention his name again and again, and each mention carries the same unresolved weight. You can consider that without softening the seriousness of the case. A person can be suspicious and still unconvicted. A community can believe and still lack final proof. History can point toward someone and still leave careful writers, using words like likely, possible, alleged, and suspected. Those words may seem small, but they matter. They keep the telling honest. In a sleep story, they also keep the tone calm. We are not here to pronounce what the courts did not pronounce. We are here to understand why the old detectives could not arrive at the public certainty their town needed. The answer is not laziness or indifference. It is the stubborn distance between evidence and proof. You return to the folder. The page is thin under your thumb. The old ink has sunk into the fibers. Somewhere outside the archive, rain may be touching the windows with a soft, regular sound. Inside, the phantom case remains itself, suggestive, painful, incomplete, and full of people who tried to make sense of it within the limits they had. And once you understand that difference between suspicion and proof, the rest of the case begins to feel less like a puzzle missing one trick piece, and more like a long corridor where every door opens onto another careful doubt. And as you walk that long corridor in the phantom case, slowly and without hurry, you begin to notice that doubt has different sounds, depending on where it comes from. Some doubt sounds like a witness pausing before answering. Some sounds like paper missing from a folder. Some sounds like a prosecutor closing a file because the law will not carry what suspicion can carry. In Texarkana, all of those sounds were present, and each one made the case a little harder to close. You can place the map of Texarkana on the desk again, smoothing its corners with the side of your hand. The roads do not look frightening on paper. They look practical, thin, pale lines connecting homes, farms, stores, and the two halves of a border town. Yet for detectives, those lines had to be read like sentences. Where could a car pass unseen? Where might a person wait? How long would it take to drive from one point to another? Which roads would a local know without thinking? The geography of the phantom case was never merely background. It shaped every question. A person familiar with rural edges could move with confidence in places that seemed empty to outsiders. A person who knew the rhythms of the town could understand when couples might drive away from lights, when roads were quiet, when patrols were unlikely. You sit with that possibility, and you can feel how the case seems to point towards someone who understood the area, even if that understanding was difficult to prove. Texarkana's state line added another quiet complication. The city did not stop neatly where one authority stopped. People crossed the line for work, errands, friends, and family. A witness might describe a car seen on the Texas side, while a related question belonged to Arkansas officers. The phantom case moved across that invisible seam in ordinary life, and detectives had to follow it with paperwork, telephone calls, and cooperation that depended on people as much as procedure. You can imagine an officer driving from one office to another with a folder on the passenger seat. The car smells of vinyl, tobacco smoke, and the damp wool of a coat thrown over the back. The road hums beneath the tires. A lead that sounded urgent at one desk may feel more uncertain by the time he arrives at the next. He walks inside, removes his hat, and begins again with the same names, the same dates, the same hope that one person in the room knows something the others missed. The phantom case asked investigators to repeat themselves often. Repetition is part of patient detection. You tell the story again to a new officer. You compare the same timeline against a fresh statement. You check a suspect's alibi once, then again, then in a different county. You ask a clerk whether a record exists, and when the clerk says no, you ask whether it might be stored under another spelling. That kind of work does not move quickly, but it is how old truth is sometimes approached. The border also affected public memory. People spoke of Texarkana as one place when fear moved through it, but the records belonged to different systems. Later, when the case became historical, researchers had to gather pieces from multiple archives and agencies, each with its own habits of preservation. You, tonight, can feel the result in the file. Some passages are detailed, others are faint. The town is unified in memory, but divided on paper. That division made suspect tracking harder too. A man could be known by one department and less familiar to another. A stolen car report could sit in one jurisdiction, while a roadside lead sat in another. A person might be arrested elsewhere for another offense, and the connection to Texarkana might depend on whether someone thought to compare the right dates. In 1946, that comparison required attention, not automation. You can see why detectives were drawn to people whose records already made them visible. A known car thief, a man with aliases, a person who crossed county lines, someone already in contact with police systems. Such a person leaves more paper than a careful stranger. Yet visibility can mislead. The person who leaves records is easier to suspect because he is easier to see. The person who leaves almost nothing may disappear completely. In the Phantom case, that tension never resolved. Was the strongest suspect strongest because he was truly connected, or because he was one of the few men whose life produced enough records to examine? You do not need to answer too quickly. The question is part of the case's texture. It sits there like a crease in the paper, visible from one angle and nearly invisible from another. As the investigation widened, officers had to balance local knowledge with outside help. Texas Rangers brought experience. State and local officers brought familiarity. Federal support could offer resources, but not a magic solution. You can imagine a room where everyone around the table knows something useful, yet no one knows enough. The coffee is cooling. The ashtray is crowded. The map is marked. The file is open, and still the answer does not step forward. That is one of the humbler truths about detective work. More people do not always mean more clarity. Sometimes, more people mean more reports, more theories, more responsibility to sort and compare. Each lead has to be assigned, checked, and returned. Each officer's memory of a conversation has to be written down before it blurs. Each strong opinion has to be tested against the same stubborn facts. You can sit with the investigators in that room and feel the fatigue that must have gathered. Not dramatic exhaustion, but the ordinary weariness of long days. The stiff collar, the sore eyes, the taste of stale coffee, the sound of a chair leg dragging over the floor as someone stands to answer the telephone. The Phantom case lived inside those human bodies, not only inside official documents. And while the officers worked, Texarkana itself kept listening. The town had to continue being a town. People still went to work, bought groceries, attended church, wrote letters, and swept porches. Yet every ordinary sound after dark might have carried a second meaning for a while. A car slowing outside, gravel shifting under a tire, a screen door tapping in the wind. You can feel how public fear becomes a thin film over daily life, altering everything without stopping everything. For detectives, that fear created urgency, but also distortion. A frightened town reports more, remembers more, imagines more, and sometimes misremembers more. A person who would never have noticed a stranger in March might notice every stranger in May. A car passing at midnight becomes significant because the mind has been trained to listen for danger. The Phantom case filled the town's attention, and attention is not always the same as accuracy. This does not mean witnesses were unreliable in some simple, dismissive way. It means they were human. You and I are human too, sitting with the file. If we heard a sound outside after weeks of fearful news, we might remember it differently than we would in a quiet year. Our minds would try to help us survive. Later, a detective would have to sort our survival memory from the facts available to be checked. That sorting is delicate. An officer must not shame a frightened witness. He must not accept every word without question either. He listens, writes, repeats the question, asks for the time again, asks whether the witness saw the license plate or only thought there was one. The witness answers. The pencil moves. A clock ticks on the wall. The room holds both kindness and scrutiny. The Phantom case could not be solved by fear. Even though fear made people speak, it needed something calmer, more durable, and less vulnerable to rumor. It needed a trace that survived challenge, or a witness who could identify a person clearly, or a confession supported by facts no one else knew. Without that, the whole investigation remained broad and restless, always moving, never settling. You can hear the restlessness in the way the case was patrolled. Officers and citizens took to the roads. Some reports describe armed residents watching from homes, and police trying to manage both protection and panic. The night air would have carried insects, engine noise, and the occasional burst of voices from men who did not want to be caught unprepared. That kind of public watchfulness can deter, but it can also confuse an investigation. More cars on the roads mean more cars to report. More armed citizens mean more opportunities for misunderstanding. More fear means more pressure on officers to act quickly, sometimes before a lead has cooled enough to examine. The detectives in the Phantom case were trying to gather precise facts inside a town that had become intensely alert to everything imprecise. That is difficult work, and it leaves marks on the file. As you follow the roads again, you may notice how often the case returns to cars. Parked cars, stolen cars, cars seen near roads, cars used for patrol, cars that carried witnesses, officers, suspects, and rumors. In 1946, the automobile was both ordinary freedom and investigative challenge. Young couples drove away from town because a car offered privacy. A suspect could move because a car offered distance. Police chased leads because a car offered reach. Cars leave traces, but not always enough. Tire impressions can be photographed, cast measured, and compared, but only if the ground cooperates and the suspect vehicle can be found. A witness may remember color, shape, or headlights, but older cars shared many features to a tired eye in poor light. License plates could solve everything if seen clearly, and solve nothing if only partly glimpsed. You can feel how close and far that kind of clue can be. The stolen car angle around Swinney carried importance, because vehicles can place a person in motion. If a suspect had access to different cars, he might be harder to connect through witness descriptions. If he stole cars frequently, his movements might be hidden inside another offense. Yet the same fact also complicates certainty. A stolen car record proves a stolen car record. It does not automatically prove the Phantom case. You turn the page and see how often the old detectives had to think in probabilities while needing proof. He could have driven there. He might have known that road. He may have possessed something similar. She said, he told her. A witness thought the build matched. These phrases have weight, but they are not bricks by themselves. They are more like loose stones gathered beside a foundation that was never fully built. That unbuilt foundation is why the case remains so contemplative. It invites us to imagine the final missing piece, but it also teaches us why imagination cannot substitute for it. You can let the thought move slowly. There may have been a moment when a witness could have seen a plate more clearly. A piece of evidence could have been preserved differently. A statement could have been taken under circumstances that made it usable. One small change might have altered the entire record. Cold cases often leave us with those small hinge points. They are quiet, almost weightless, until you see what might have turned on them. A phone call answered sooner. A road checked in daylight. A suspect's clothing kept instead of returned. A spouse willing and legally able to testify. A clerk spelling a name correctly. In retrospect, these details feel like doors that were almost open. But people working in real time do not know which details will become doors. They stand in a room full of ordinary objects and future significance is hidden from them. The Phantom investigators had to choose where to spend each hour. Every choice meant not choosing something else. That is not failure. That is the human limit inside every investigation. You can rest there for a moment. The lamplight is steady. The file is open. Outside, the imagined rain has stopped, leaving the street with a dim shine. You are not trying to solve the Phantom case tonight. You are trying to understand why the people who tried hardest could not force it open, even when the whole town wanted the same thing. And once the immediate fear receded, the case entered a quieter season, where the problem was no longer how to catch someone before another night. but how to keep an answer from disappearing forever. That quieter season in the Phantom case may be the most revealing part, because it shows what remains after urgency leaves the room. The first weeks of a major investigation are loud with movement. Officers drive, phones ring, reporters wait, and people come forward. Later, the noise thins. The families still care. Some detectives still care, but the town gradually returns to ordinary sounds, and the case has to survive without constant public force. You can imagine a police office months after the last attack, with summer heat pressing against the windows. A fan turns slowly and stirs paper more than air. The same file sits on a desk, but fewer people walk past it now. Other cases arrive. Other duties call. A deputy who once spent every hour on the Phantom case is sent to a burglary, a traffic death, a domestic quarrel, a missing cow, some small duty that belongs to county life. This is not neglect, it is reality. Police departments cannot stop time for one case forever, even when that case matters deeply. The Phantom file had to compete with the ongoing life of Texarkana and the surrounding counties. New reports came in. Old leads dried out. Suspects moved away or were jailed for other things. Witnesses became harder to find. The first urgency became persistence, and persistence is quieter. A cold case begins, in one sense, when the world stops rearranging itself around it. The file is no longer the first thing on every desk. It becomes a thing someone returns to after other work is done, or when a new lead comes in, or when an anniversary article stirs a memory. You can feel the shift in the paper itself. The early reports are immediate. The later notes are spaced farther apart, like footsteps down a long hallway. Detectives who stayed with the Phantom case had to develop a different kind of endurance. They were no longer chasing the heat of the moment. They were tending embers. A man calls after 2 years because he remembered a name. A woman writes from another town because a newspaper story brought back a detail. An officer hears that a prisoner in another state has made a claim. Each ember must be lifted carefully to see whether it holds any warmth. Most do not. That is the difficult truth. Most late leads in old cases fail. They come from memory, rumor, coincidence, confession, resentment, or hope. Yet detectives still have to check them, because one late lead can sometimes carry what the first investigation missed. The patience required is not romantic. It is repetitive, administrative, and often disappointing. It is also necessary. You can sit beside an investigator as he opens a letter with a paper knife. The envelope is thin. The stamp is postmarked from a town hundreds of miles away. The handwriting slopes unevenly, and the paper inside smells faintly of a drawer where it may have rested before being mailed. The writer has a theory about the Phantom. The detective reads it once, then again, making notes in the margin. Perhaps the theory names Swinney. Perhaps it names someone else. Perhaps it says an uncle confessed after drinking, or a neighbor vanished after the spring of 1946, or a man kept a strange hood in a trunk. The detective cannot believe it just because it is vivid. He checks whether the person was in Texarkana. He checks dates. He checks jail records, military records, death records, and whatever else the era allows. Often, the lead fades. This kind of fading can wear on a person. Hope rises in small, measured amounts, then must be set down again. A detective learns not to let hope run ahead of proof. You, as the quiet detective tonight, learn that too. You hold each new detail with your fingertips, not your whole hand. You let it be possible, then ask whether it can be supported. The families, meanwhile, had to live with a different kind of patience. The police file is official, but family memory is intimate. A birthday comes, a holiday comes, a familiar song plays, a place in town is passed in a car. The case is not always spoken of, yet it is present in the pattern of what cannot be forgotten. You can feel how unsolved cases lengthen grief because the mind keeps one small room open for news. The Phantom case touched several families, each with its own way of carrying that open room. The names belong to real people: Jimmy Hollis, Mary Jean Larey, Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, Virgil Starks, and Katie Starks. Some survived and had to live forward. Some did not return to their families. All of them became part of a file that strangers would read for decades. When you say those names gently, the case changes shape again. It becomes less about whether one suspect can be proven, and more about the long human aftermath of uncertainty. Detectives may retire, reporters may move on, and films may turn the phantom into an image, but families remember the person before the case name. That is why careful language matters. The mystery should never become larger than the lives it contains. In the quieter years, the phantom case also became a subject for people who were not investigators in any formal sense. Local historians, journalists, researchers, and interested citizens gathered details and compared accounts. Some did this work with care. Some preferred the more dramatic version. The difference is easy to feel when you read closely. Careful work admits uncertainty. Dramatic work tries to erase it. You and I stay with the careful work. It is slower, but it lets the people remain real. It allows the detectives to be human, rather than either heroes or failures. It allows witnesses to be frightened without being dismissed. It allows suspects to remain suspects unless the evidence goes further. In the Phantom case, that careful stance may be the only way to remain truthful. The old files, when reopened, would have presented both invitation and warning. The invitation is obvious. Maybe something was missed. Maybe a name appears in two places no one compared. Maybe a small inconsistency points toward a hidden truth. The warning is quieter. Old files can persuade you with their own incompleteness. They can make a theory feel strong simply because the missing counter-evidence is gone. A good investigator knows that absence must be handled delicately. If a suspect has no alibi in the surviving file, that does not always mean he had no alibi. It may mean no one wrote it down, or the page was lost, or the question was never asked because another fact ruled him out at the time. You can see how easy it would be to build certainty on gaps, and how important it is to resist. The Phantom case is full of such gaps. Some are factual, some are legal, some are archival, some are created by memory. The work of later review is not to fill every gap with speculation, but to mark them honestly. Here, the evidence is strong. Here, it is weak. Here, the public story may have outrun the file. Here, the file may have once held something now missing. That is slow work, but it is clean work. You can picture a later researcher making notes in pencil rather than ink, leaving room for correction. The table is covered with copies. A cup of tea cools beside a stack of clippings. Outside, traffic moves through modern Texarkana, but on the table, it is still 1946. Dates are checked. Names are circled. A question mark is placed beside a statement that has been repeated too often without support. The sensory world of research is quieter than the sensory world of the original investigation, but it has its own texture. The copy machine warms the paper. The archive chair creaks when you shift. A librarian lowers her voice even though no one else is near. Microfilm dust leaves a faint dryness in your throat. The past arrives not as thunder, but as a series of small, manageable sounds. And in those small sounds, the Phantom case remains open to thought. Not open in the sense that every theory deserves equal weight, but open because the final proof did not arrive. You keep returning to that phrase, final proof, because it is the missing instrument in the room. Suspicion played its notes. Memory played its notes. Rumor played far too loudly. But proof, the kind that could end the public question, never carried the melody to its last bar. When later generations asked why detectives could not crack the Phantom case, they sometimes imagined one overlooked genius could have solved it. That is a comforting idea because it makes failure individual. It says the answer was there and someone simply failed to see it. But the file suggests something more complicated and more ordinary. Many people looked. Some looked very hard. The missing piece may not have been visible from where they stood. That is not always satisfying, but it may be true. A witness may never have seen enough. The suspect may have left little behind. The best statement may have been blocked by law. The evidence may have degraded before science could help. The incidents may have been more complex than the single Phantom name suggests. A case can remain unsolved through an accumulation of small limits rather than one grand mistake. You let that idea settle. It lands softly, like dust returning to a shelf. The Phantom case does not need a grand mistake to explain its silence. It needs only darkness, fear, imperfect memory, legal rules, ordinary time, and the missing trace that never came into safe hands. Those things are enough. They have kept many cases unsolved. Still, detectives did what detectives do. They made lists, they checked names, they took statements, they drove roads, they warned the public, they examined objects, they interviewed suspects, they tested confessions, they argued about connections, they carried the file forward as long as they could. If the case could not be cracked, it was not because no one knocked against it. You can hear that knocking in the archive, faintly, across the years. It is the sound of patient work meeting a door that does not open. Not a dramatic sound, more like knuckles on old wood, repeated at intervals, with pauses between. Each generation listens to see whether anything inside will answer. For the Phantom case, the answer has always been partial, muffled, and uncertain. And so the investigation's long middle years became a kind of conversation between what the file could still say and what the town wished it could say. That conversation often returned to the surviving witnesses, because survivors carry a kind of evidence paper cannot hold. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larey lived through the first attack, and their accounts gave investigators the first descriptions associated with the Phantom case. Katie Stark survived the later attack at her home, and her account gave another living voice to the file. You can sit with those voices gently, because survival does not make remembering simple. A survivor may be asked to repeat the most difficult night of their life many times, first to officers, then perhaps to family, then perhaps to reporters, attorneys, later investigators or writers. Each telling can preserve detail, but it can also reopen feeling. The listener, if wise, does not press for drama. The listener asks carefully, waits through silence, and accepts that some details may remain blurred, because the mind protected itself. You can imagine Mary Jean Larey speaking to officers, after the first incident, trying to describe a person whose face had been hidden. Her words would have mattered enormously. Height, clothing, voice, manner, and movement became clues because they were what she had. Yet, each clue had to pass through the conditions of that night. Darkness, fear, surprise, and the strangeness of being forced to observe while wanting only to survive. When you read a survivor's statement, it is easy to want certainty from it. But a statement is also a human document. It reflects not only what happened, but what could be perceived, understood, and later described. If a detective asks the same question twice, the answer may shift slightly. That shift may mean new clarity or confusion, or simply the pressure of trying to be useful. Patient investigators know this and listen for the steady parts without punishing the uncertain ones. Katie Stark's survival brought different questions. Her home was not a secluded road. Her experience changed the pattern people thought they understood. She had to describe sounds, moments, and impressions from inside a domestic space suddenly made unfamiliar. You can picture the room afterward, quiet except for officers moving carefully. The smell of disturbed dust, cool night air entering where glass had broken, and furniture standing exactly where it had stood before, now part of a case file. A home scene carries its own investigative language: windows, lamps, doorways, lines of sight, distances from the road, neighbors close enough or too far away. A detective in that room would measure not only objects, but possibilities. Where did the person stand? What could be seen from outside? Could the act have been planned, or was it opportunistic? Did the setting connect to the earlier Phantom case, or did fear make the connection stronger than the evidence? You can see how the survivors' statements helped, and also how they could not finish the work alone. A living witness can anchor a case, but if the attacker was masked or unseen, the anchor may not reach the bottom. The witness can say what happened to them. They may not be able to say who did it. That distinction is painful, but it is central. Detectives likely returned to those accounts again and again, testing them against suspects and theories. If Swinney was the suspect, did the descriptions fit him? Did his voice, build, habits, or movements align? If another man was considered, did the same details point elsewhere? The file would have been read in both directions, from event to suspect, and from suspect back to event. Each direction reveals different weaknesses. You can hold a suspect photograph beside a witness description and feel the temptation to make them match. The human mind wants recognition, a jawline, a height, a posture, a certain look in the eyes. But in the phantom case, the face that mattered most had been hidden. A masked description leaves too much room. It gives a shape without identity, and shape alone rarely convicts. This is one of the saddest practical facts in the case. The phantom's covering, if the first account is taken as central to the pattern, did more than frighten the public. It took away the most direct path to recognition. In a world before modern forensic reach, a face seen clearly by a survivor might have changed everything. Without that, detectives had to work around an absence at the very center of the event. The newspapers turned the mask into symbol. Detectives had to treat it as obstruction. Those are different postures. A symbol grows larger in public imagination. An obstruction sits stubbornly in the evidence and says, "You cannot see past me." You and I can feel both meanings. But the second is the one that explains more about why the case stayed unresolved. Survivors also had to live with the public nature of their memories. In a small city, people know names. They ask questions. They offer sympathy, sometimes awkwardly. They repeat details. A person who survives becomes connected to the case in the minds of others, even while trying to remain a whole private life. That burden seldom appears fully in official records, but it belongs to the human side of every cold case. You can imagine years later, someone asking an old question again. The room is quieter now. The survivor has aged. The person asking may be careful, but the question still returns to a night long past. The air smells of curtains warmed by afternoon sun. A clock ticks. The answer comes slowly, not because the person is hiding something, but because memory is a room with some lights burned out. What investigators can take from such late interviews is limited but not worthless. A long-held memory may preserve a sensory detail omitted from a report, a tone of voice, a smell, a phrase, a direction of movement. Yet later memory also gathers influence from newspapers, conversations, and dreams. The detective must listen with compassion and compare with discipline. That balance is difficult, and the phantom case required it repeatedly. The same is true of witnesses who were not direct victims, people who saw a car, heard a shot, noticed a stranger, or remembered an odd remark. All became potential holders of small pieces. Some pieces may have been genuine, others may have belonged to ordinary life mistaken for significance. You can feel how hard it would be to know the difference in a town where fear had sharpened every eye. A car parked near a road might be innocent. A man walking late might be returning home. A light in a field might belong to a farmer. The same facts during the phantom case could seem charged with meaning. Detectives had to restore ordinary possibilities to a town that had temporarily lost trust in the ordinary. That is patient work, and not always appreciated by people who want every suspicious detail pursued as if it were the key. But a good investigation must eliminate as well as connect. It must find out that the parked car belonged to a courting couple, unrelated to the case, that the late walker had a reason, that the light in the field was exactly what it seemed. Each elimination may disappoint someone, but it clears space around the truth. In the phantom case, many such clearings likely happened, though the public remembered mainly the leads that seemed dramatic. You can picture the wastebasket beside a detective's desk, filled with envelopes, rough drafts, and carbon sheets. Not evidence thrown away, but administrative scraps, the paper trail of labor. The official reports remained, but much of the work lived in conversations, brief calls, small checks, and mental notes that never became part of the story told later. That lost labor is another reason old cases can look thinner than they were. When we read the phantom case now, we see what survived. We do not see every hour spent proving that a rumor was false. We do not see every tired drive after midnight that found nothing. We do not see every officer who knocked at a door and learned only that someone had been mistaken. Absence can make an investigation look less active than it was, simply because negative work leaves faint traces. That thought softens the judgment. It does not solve the case, but it lets us understand the people who tried. The detectives could never crack the phantom case, partly because the case did not present a clean crack to widen. It presented many fine lines, some real, some imagined, some disappearing when touched. They followed the lines they could see. The final break never opened. As the records aged, one more complication entered the room. The case had to compete not only with lost evidence, but with the story people wanted it to be. The story people often wanted from the phantom case was simple: a masked predator, a frightened town, a heroic investigation, a hidden suspect, perhaps a final answer known privately but never proven. That story has power because it gives shape to uncertainty. But the file itself is less simple, and if you sit with it patiently, you can feel the difference between shape and truth. Shape helps us remember. Truth asks us to slow down. Popular retellings often begin with atmosphere, as we have tonight, but they sometimes let atmosphere take over. They linger on the image of the hood, the dark road, the town buying locks and weapons, the patrol cars moving through humid nights. Those details are real enough in their way, yet they can begin to cover the quieter investigative questions. Who was interviewed? Which facts were held back? Which lead failed? Which legal rule prevented testimony? Which evidence did not survive? You can let the atmosphere remain, while still returning to the desk. That is where the case lives most honestly for our purposes. On the desk, the phantom is not a movie figure. He is an unidentified person or persons in a set of reports. On the desk, every dramatic detail has to become useful or be set aside. A mask becomes a barrier to identification. Fear becomes a source of unreliable tips. Silence becomes a problem of proof. The film and folklore surrounding the case also shaped how later people imagined Texarkana. For some, the phantom case became the defining story of the town. Yet Texarkana was more than its fear in 1946. It was a working city, a border city, a place of families, rail lines, shops, schools, churches, and ordinary concerns. Holding that fuller picture matters because the case happened to a community, not a stage set. You can walk through that fuller Texarkana in your mind. Morning light falls on storefront glass. A man sweeps the sidewalk before opening. A woman carries folded laundry from a line while distant traffic passes. A child rides a bicycle over a patch of uneven pavement. The state line sits underfoot, remarkable to visitors and ordinary to residents. The phantom case moved through this world, but it did not erase it. Detectives worked inside that ordinary world too. They were not characters waiting for a dramatic scene. They had families, bills, aches, habits, and private doubts. Some were skilled, some may have made mistakes. All were working within a system shaped by its time. When we ask why they could never crack the phantom case, we should ask as people who understand that investigation is labor, not fate. The desire for a tidy story can also make us overstate the certainty around Swinney. He may well remain the most compelling suspect in many accounts, but compelling is not conclusive. The distinction may feel repetitive, yet repetition is useful here because the case itself keeps returning to that point. Suspicion gathered. Proof did not. The road went almost to the house, and then ended in grass. You can picture that road at dusk, not as a crime scene now, but as an image for the investigation. The tire tracks are visible for a while, pressed into damp earth. Then they cross a patch of harder ground and fade. You kneel, brush dirt with your fingers, look ahead, and see several possible directions. No one tells you which one is true. You stand again, and the evening cools around you. That is the feeling later researchers inherited. Some followed Swinney. Some explored alternate suspects. Some questioned whether all attacks were connected. Some focused on policing, culture, and media. Each approach found something worth noting, but none produced the public evidence needed to settle the matter. The phantom case remained broad enough to invite inquiry and narrow enough to frustrate it. A case like this can teach humility. It tells us that not every mystery is a puzzle built for solving by later observers. Some mysteries are damaged records of human events, where essential facts were never captured. We can study them, honor them, and understand them better, but we may not be able to complete them. The phantom case may belong in that category, though people will likely keep testing it as long as the file can be read. You can feel the gentleness in that humility. It does not give up on truth. It simply stops pretending that truth is always waiting intact behind the next page. Sometimes truth was present in a room where no one could see it clearly. Sometimes it passed a witness at night without leaving a name. Sometimes it was spoken in a statement that could not be used. Sometimes it died with the person who knew it. That last possibility is one of the quietest in the phantom case. If the responsible person was never charged and later died, then the full personal answer may have left the world long ago. If a spouse, friend, or accomplice knew more and never testified, that knowledge may have vanished too. The file can preserve much, but it cannot preserve unspoken memory. An archive can hold paper, not every silence. You sit with that silence and do not rush to fill it. The lamp makes a small circle. The room beyond it is calm. You hear the faint rasp of a page turning, the soft settling of a cardboard box, the distant sound of a car moving through wet streets outside. The phantom case is old now, and its silence is old too. Old silence has a different quality from new silence. It no longer asks loudly, it waits. Still, waiting is not nothing. Waiting keeps the question available. It allows careful people to return, to correct errors, to separate fact from embellishment, to keep victims' names from being swallowed by a nickname. It allows a community to remember without surrendering entirely to legend. It allows us, tonight, to sit with the case in a way that is neither fearful nor careless. And as we sit, the investigation's greatest lesson may be that a case can be deeply investigated, widely remembered, and still unresolved, because those three facts do not cancel one another. They coexist in the phantom case, page after page. The investigation was real. The memory was powerful. The resolution never came in the form the law required. That understanding prepares you to read the final layers of the file more calmly, where later claims, old suspicions, and the official status of the case all rest together without fully merging. Those final layers of the phantom case are not final in the sense of ending the story, but final in the sense that they belong to the quieter years, when the papers had cooled and the voices had thinned. You can open them with the same care you would give a brittle letter. The pages may include later interviews, notes from researchers, newspaper anniversary pieces, and comments from people who believed they had inherited a fragment of truth from someone older. Each item asks to be heard, but none should be allowed to speak louder than it can support. In those later claims, Ewell Swinney often appears again, because some stories return to the strongest suspect the way a hand returns to a sore place. His name carries gravity in the phantom case. It gathers the wife's reported statements, his criminal history, the timing of his imprisonment, and the belief of certain investigators that the right man had been found even if the case could not be tried. You can understand why people keep coming back to him. A strong suspect gives the mind a place to rest, but rest is not always resolution. You sit with Swinney's name on the page and let it remain what it is. Not a conviction, not an acquittal of history. A suspect, powerful in the law, important in the investigation, yet still separated from official certainty by that old legal distance. The room is quiet enough that you can hear the pencil tap once against the table, not in impatience, but in thought. Some later accounts suggest investigators were convinced privately. That kind of private conviction has its own fragile authority. It may come from evidence lost to public view, or from experience, or from conversations never fully recorded. It may also harden over time, as an investigator's memory gathers around the most persuasive theory and leaves weaker possibilities behind. You do not have to dismiss it. You only have to hold it carefully. The phantom case asks for that careful holding again and again. If a retired officer says he believed Swinney was responsible, you listen. If the file does not contain what a court would need, you note that too. If a later writer repeats the belief as certainty, you slow down. The difference between those postures may seem small in conversation, but it is large in truth. It is the difference between honoring experience and turning experience into proof. You can imagine a retired detective years later, perhaps in a living room, perhaps at a kitchen table, speaking about the case that never quite left him. The room smells of coffee, paper, and the faint dust of old photographs. His hand may rest near a folder he has kept longer than he meant to keep it. He does not need to perform certainty. He has lived with the case too long for performance. Yet even his certainty, if he has it, cannot reopen a courtroom that never heard the evidence. The official status of the phantom case therefore remains shaped by what had not happened. No trial for the central attacks, no legally established culprit, no public confession supported and admitted in the way a court would require. The suspected answer, if one accepts Swinney, lived beside the unsolved status rather than replacing it. That dual condition may be difficult, but it is one of the truest things about the case. You turn to other later claims, and the texture changes. Some are more speculative. A person remembers a relative acting strangely. Another recalls a story told after a funeral. Someone connects a man's disappearance from town with the end of the attacks. These are the kinds of fragments that gather around famous cold cases. They may feel intimate because they arrive through family lines, but intimacy is not the same as verification. A family story can carry truth for decades. It can also carry misunderstanding with equal loyalty. A child overhears adults and fills in the gaps. A name is misremembered. A date is shifted to fit a known event. A rumor told once as possibility becomes family certainty after 50 years. You can feel the softness and danger of that process. The story is warm in the hand, but it may not hold its shape under scrutiny. Detectives and researchers must ask gentle questions of such stories. Who first told you this? When did you hear it? Was it before or after a book or film about the phantom case? Did the person claim first-hand knowledge or repeat what someone else believed? Is there any document, photograph, letter, arrest record, or travel record that touches the claim? These questions are not meant to wound memory. They are meant to protect it from being asked to do work it cannot do. You can sit in a quiet archive and compare one such story against city directories, prison records, old newspapers, and maps. The work is almost meditative. A page turns, a name is checked, a date aligns for a moment, then fails, or a detail aligns well enough to deserve another hour. Most claims do not survive this kind of attention. A few remain possible. Almost none become proof. The phantom case also attracted theories because the attack stopped. People naturally look for a reason when a pattern ends. If Swinney was jailed, perhaps that explains it. If another suspect moved, perhaps that explains it. If the responsible person died, perhaps that explains it. If fear and patrols made the risk too high, perhaps that explains it. You can see how each explanation offers a different kind of closure, and how none by itself can settle the matter. Patterns can stop for reasons we never learn. A person may lose opportunity, interest, nerve, or freedom. A person may be injured, arrested, hospitalized, deployed, or displaced. A person may never have intended a pattern at all, and the events grouped under one name may not share a single hand. The phantom case leaves each of these possibilities somewhere in the room. Some are more plausible than others, but plausibility still falls short of proof. The end of the attacks gave Texarkana relief, and relief can quiet investigation in subtle ways. When immediate danger seems to pass, the town breathes differently. Doors may still be locked, but conversations change. Officers still pursue leads, but public urgency eases. Newspapers turn to other events. That easing is merciful for a community, yet it can also allow an unsolved case to drift into the long middle distance. You can picture the first nights when people began to sleep more normally again. The porch lights remained, perhaps, but the listening softened. A car outside did not always bring someone to the curtain. Young people eventually drove again. Stores returned to ordinary closing rituals. The city's fear did not vanish all at once, but it loosened. The phantom case, meanwhile, did not loosen for those who still needed an answer. This separation between public relief and private grief is common in unsolved cases. A community may move on because it has to. Families move on too, in practical ways, but not in the same way. Their missing answer remains personal. Detectives who cared may experience a third form of carrying, somewhere between public duty and private burden. The file becomes part of their inner weather. You can sense that in later remarks from those connected to the investigation, where the case is often spoken of with a mixture of certainty, regret, and resignation. They may believe the right suspect was known. They may regret that evidence was not enough. They may accept that time has taken too much. Those feelings do not contradict one another. They sit together like papers clipped in the same corner. The phantom case is especially suited to this layered feeling because it has always lived near the boundary between history and folklore. The history asks for dates, locations, names, and procedure. The folklore asks for image, atmosphere, and repetition. One says, here is what was documented. The other says, here is how people remember being afraid. Both matter to understanding Texarkana, but only one can bear legal weight. As you listen tonight, you can let folklore soften into the background and keep the file near your hand. The file does not remove atmosphere, it changes the kind of atmosphere. Instead of the loud shadow of a legend, you get the quieter air of an office where a case remains unfinished. The dust, the paper, the typewriter ribbon, the low voices, the map pins, the waiting. This is the atmosphere detectives actually knew. And in that atmosphere, every theory had to come back to the same tests. Could the suspect be placed near the relevant locations? Did the suspect match what was known? Was there a connection to the victims or roads? Did physical evidence support the claim? Could a witness identify him? Could a confession be used? Could the prosecutor prove the case? If the answer failed at any point, the theory remained only a theory. That may sound procedural, but procedure is what keeps an investigation from becoming a rumor with a badge. The phantom case had enough rumor already. It needed procedure like a room needs a level floor. Without it, every fear tilts toward accusation. With it, some accusations still fail, but at least they fail for reasons that can be named. You rest with that thought, while the file lies open. The paper is still. The imagined office has grown late. A clock ticks somewhere beyond the door, and the hallway light makes a pale stripe under the threshold. You can feel the detective's dilemma more clearly now. They were trying to hold a level floor under a town that had been tilted by fear, and the floor never quite reached the far wall. When later claims came in, the floor had to be built again each time. A new suspect, a new story, a new connection. The old questions returned patiently. Where was he in February? Where was he in March? Where was he in April? Where was he in May? Did he know Texarkana? Did he own or steal a car? Did he have access to a weapon? Did anyone see him? Did anything survive that can be checked? You can hear the rhythm of those questions. It is not thrilling, but it is steady, like rain along a gutter. Cold casework depends on that steadiness. A detective cannot be carried away by the first answer that sounds right. He must ask the same plain questions until the answer either strengthens or dissolves. In the Phantom case, answers kept dissolving before they could become official. Some dissolutions were legal, some were evidentiary, some were chronological. A suspect might fit one date and fail another. A confession might contain a detail from newspapers, rather than from direct knowledge. A family story might be moving, but impossible to verify. A witness identification might come too late, after too much public imagery had filled the mind. Each failure left the case standing where it had been, only older. Age itself then became a suspect, in a way. Not a person, but a force acting against clarity. Age faded photographs. Age altered roads. Age changed names through marriage, relocation, and death. Age made people harder to find, and memories harder to test. You can feel age in the stiffness of old paper and the brittle edges of newspaper clippings. It does not hurry, it simply keeps working. The Phantom case aged under that force for decades. Every year made a courtroom solution less likely. Every year made first-hand testimony rarer. Every year made physical evidence, if any remained, more uncertain. Yet every year also made the case more compelling to those who study unsolved mysteries, because age adds a hush that draws people in. The challenge is to let that hush deepen respect, not distort the facts. You can see the difference in how people approach the victims' names. A careless telling uses them as milestones on the way to the legend. A careful telling returns to them as people. Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, Virgil Starks, Katie Starks, Jimmy Hollis, Mary Jean Larey. When you place each name in the room, The Phantom case becomes less about a nickname and more about lives interrupted, lives survived and families left waiting. The detectives, too, deserve to remain human. They were not all-knowing figures in dark coats, and they were not simply men who failed. They were workers in a difficult case, using the tools of their time under public pressure. Some decisions might be questioned now. Some records might have been better preserved. Some leads might have been followed differently. But hindsight is a bright light, and bright light can make old shadows look simpler than they were. You can sit with a detective at the end of a day in 1946. His shirt collar is damp from the heat. His hands smell faintly of gasoline from the patrol car and paper from the office. He has spoken to frightened people, skeptical people, grieving people, and people eager to be useful. He has heard rumors that sounded possible and watched them fail. He goes home, but the case does not quite leave with his hat on the hook. That interior burden does not solve anything, but it helps explain the patience in the file. Detectives kept at the Phantom case because the alternative was accepting silence too soon. Yet no amount of burden could make a weak case strong in court. The tragedy of patient investigation is that effort and result do not always match. Sometimes the most exhausting work still ends in a folder returned to a shelf. A shelf is not the same as forgetting. The Phantom case remained available to be reopened, reconsidered, and retold. Each retelling chooses what to emphasize. Tonight, we keep our attention on why proof could not be gathered, why suspicion did not become conviction, and why an old border town case became both thoroughly investigated and unsolved. The answer is spread across the file, not hidden in one dramatic turn. As you turn another page, the paper gives a tiny rasp under your fingers, and the case shifts toward the public records that kept the mystery alive after the official urgency faded. The public records of the Phantom case are like a second archive beside the police file. They include newspapers, interviews, books, documentaries, and community remembrances. They preserve details that might otherwise have vanished, but they also preserve the mood of each era that revisited the case. You can read an article from the immediate spring of 1946 and feel urgency. You can read an anniversary piece decades later and feel distance. Both are part of the record, though not in the same way. Newspapers from the time show a city trying to be informed, while also trying to be reassured. Officials had to decide what to release. Reporters had to decide what to emphasize. Citizens read the paper at breakfast, at work, in barbershops, and on porches, folding and refolding the same columns until the creases weakened. You can smell newsprint in warm fingers. You can hear the paper snap as someone turns to the latest report. The press helped spread warnings and gather tips. That was useful. It also helped spread the Phantom name, and that had mixed consequences. A name makes a case memorable. It makes people pay attention. It gives reporters a shorthand and the public a focus. But it also risks turning an unknown person into a figure of imagination, and imagination can become larger than the evidence. Detectives likely understood this tension. They needed the public's help, yet they needed the public not to drown them in rumor. They needed witnesses to come forward, yet they needed confessions tested against details that had not been printed. If too much information became public, false confessors could sound convincing. If too little was shared, people might feel abandoned or invent answers. There is no perfect balance in such a case. You can picture an officer speaking with a reporter near the station. The afternoon is bright. Dust moves in the sunlight. The reporter holds a notebook and waits. The officer chooses words carefully, giving enough to inform, but not enough to damage the investigation. Behind him, in the office, the telephone rings again. The case is not only what happened on the roads. It is also what can be said about what happened. Public information became part of the investigative landscape. A witness who came forward after reading an article might be helpful, but their memory could also be shaped by what they had read. A confession after a detailed newspaper story had to be tested more carefully. A suspect who followed the news might know what officers were looking for. The press did not cause the case to fail, but it added another layer detectives had to navigate. The Phantom case unfolded in an era when newspapers were central to public life. Radio mattered too, but print gave the fear something to hold. People could reread paragraphs, cut clippings, mail articles to relatives, and save them in drawers. Later, those same clippings became historical evidence of public knowledge. You can see the circularity there. The paper shaped memory, and then memory returned to the paper as history. This is why a careful reader asks what was known publicly at each point. If a later statement includes a detail printed widely in 1946, that detail may not prove first-hand knowledge. If it includes something held back, it may matter more. But knowing what was held back is itself difficult, because records of investigative secrecy are not always complete. The old file may not tell us every detail officers kept private. You can feel how the questions keep branching. To evaluate a confession, you need to know what the public knew. To know what the public knew, you need newspapers, radio transcripts if any exist, and memory of local talk. To know local talk, you need witnesses. To evaluate witnesses, you need to know what they read and heard. The phantom case becomes less like a locked room and more like a field of footpaths crossing in dusk. In that field, some paths are worn from repeated walking. Swinney is one, the mask is another, the saxophone is another, the state line, the patrols, the rumors, the stopped attacks, the later film. Each path draws attention because it feels meaningful. Your task, as the quiet detective tonight, is not to avoid those paths, but to notice where they lead and where they simply circle back. The saxophone, for example, remains one of the most tangible objects in the public memory of the case. Betty Jo Booker's instrument gives the story a particular human sound. It reminds us she had music, practice, performance, and skill. It also became an object detectives hoped might surface with a suspect. When it was later found, it returned to the file without unlocking it. That is the kind of clue that stays in memory, because it is vivid, even though it did not solve the case. You can imagine the instrument case, resting on an evidence table, scuffed, handled, and quiet. A saxophone is meant for breath, not silence. Its keys wait under the fingers. Its brass catches light. In the phantom case, it became part of investigative waiting, an object that might have led somewhere and then did not. The sadness of that is gentle but real. Not every meaningful object becomes a useful key. The same is true of locations. Roads and houses can become powerful in memory, but their evidentiary value depends on what they preserve. A road remembers nothing unless someone saw something there, or tracks remained, or an object was found. A house preserves only what can be documented, collected, and understood. The human mind may feel that a place knows, but detectives have to ask what a place can actually show. You can stand in your imagination on one of those old roads near Texarkana. The night is not theatrical, it is simply dark. Grass brushes the edge of the road. Insects make a steady sound. The air smells of soil, leaves, and cooling engine metal. You look down and see that the ground might take a print if it were soft enough, or might take nothing if it were dry. The difference could matter for 80 years. Evidence is often that fragile. A shower of rain, a passing car, a curious crowd, a necessary rescue, or the limits of daylight can alter what remains. Detectives in 1946 had to preserve scenes under conditions that were not always ideal. Public fear might draw people near. Reporters might arrive. Family members might need to be protected from the sight of things no one should have to see. The case file is the result of all those practical pressures. To say that evidence was imperfect is not to blame anyone automatically. It is to understand the world in which the phantom case happened. Crime scene practice was evolving. Forensic science was useful but narrower. Communication was slower. Jurisdictional boundaries were more cumbersome. Investigators had skill, but not every tool later generations would take for granted. The case cannot be lifted out of its time without distorting it. You can hold the old camera in your mind, heavy and deliberate. A photograph had to be framed, taken, developed, printed, and stored. It did not instantly reveal whether it had captured enough. A modern investigator can take hundreds of images from every angle. An older officer might take far fewer, with more reliance on notes and memory. Each photograph that survives is valuable, but each missing angle is a question no one can now answer. The same is true of audio. Today, investigators may have recordings of interviews, In 1946, many statements were written or typed from notes. Tone, hesitation, and exact wording could be lost. A witness's phrase might be summarized by an officer trying to be efficient. Later, that summary becomes the only surviving version. You read it and wonder what the voice sounded like. The file does not say. This is one reason late certainty should be approached gently. We are often trying to reach firm conclusions from records that were not created for our future questions. The original detectives were trying to solve the case in their present, not build a perfect archive for people decades later. They wrote down what seemed important then. Some of what seems important now may not have been preserved, and yet the records they did leave remain precious. Without them, the phantom case would be almost entirely rumor. With them, we can trace the shape of the investigation, the dates, the names, the legal problems, the suspect focus, the public fear, and the unanswered questions. The file may be incomplete, but it is not empty. You can be grateful for what survives while still noticing what is missing. This dual posture, gratitude and caution, is useful in every old mystery. It keeps us from demanding impossible perfection from the past. It also keeps us from accepting every later claim simply because the past is incomplete. In the phantom case, both habits matter. We respect the work. We test the stories. We let the unknown remain unknown where it has not been proven. As public records carried the case forward, the phantom became a kind of mirror for changing ideas about crime, media, and memory. In one era, the focus rested on local fear and patrols. In another, on the suspected man and his wife's statements. In another, on whether forensic advances might reopen old evidence. Each era asked the case a slightly different question, and the case answered with the same limited set of facts. You can see yourself joining that long line of readers, but quietly, without demanding that the file perform for you. The chair is plain, the desk is steady, the light is low. You turn a page, and instead of expecting revelation, you ask what kind of work this page can honestly do. Some pages establish dates, some preserve voices, some show public mood, some show frustration. A few raise possibilities that still matter. The case's endurance may come from the fact that it offers both specificity and incompletion. It has dates, roads, names, objects, suspects, and a distinctive place. But it lacks the final answer. That combination holds attention. A vague mystery dissolves. A fully solved mystery settles. The phantom case remains suspended between them, detailed enough to study and unresolved enough to return to. You and I can return without sharpening the edges. The sleep of this story depends on patience, not dread. The old detectives had plenty of fear around them already. What they needed, and what we can offer now, is steadiness. We can let the roads be roads, the files be files, and the people be people. We can keep the unknown from becoming a spectacle. When the file moves into the modern era, the questions become softer, but no less persistent. Could anything still be tested? Could any family story be checked against records? Could any forgotten box contain a document that shifts the weight? Could a clearer understanding of the original investigation explain why certain choices were made? These are modest questions, and modest questions are often the right ones for old cases. A modern cold case review would begin by inventorying what remains. Not what people say remains, but what can be physically located. Evidence envelopes, photographs, reports, autopsy records, ballistics notes, interview statements, correspondence, suspect files, newspaper clippings, chain of custody records, if any exist. You can picture each item placed on a table, not dramatically, but carefully, as though the past is being asked to account for itself, one object at a time. The inventory might reveal opportunities, or it might reveal loss, a missing envelope, a degraded item, a photograph without a label, a report copied from a copy, a notation that refers to an attachment no longer present. Every cold case reviewer knows the small sinking feeling of a reference to something that cannot be found. The page says "See attached." The attachment is gone. In the phantom case, the long passage of time makes such losses especially likely. Records may have moved between offices, storage spaces may have changed, standards may have shifted. Some items may have been discarded before their future value was understood. Again, this is not always negligence. It is often the ordinary attrition of institutions that did not know a file would still matter to listeners and researchers generations later. If a testable item did remain, modern science would still require caution. Contamination, chain of custody, mixed sources, and uncertain relevance can all complicate results. A DNA profile, even if found, must be connected to the crime in a meaningful way. Touching an object is not always the same as committing an offense. Being near a scene is not always the same as being responsible. Science is powerful, but it does not remove the need for interpretation. This is another place where popular imagination can run ahead. People hear old DNA and expect a clean answer. Sometimes that happens, and when it does, it can feel almost miraculous. But many old cases do not preserve the right material, or the material cannot be linked clearly enough, or the result points only to someone who had an innocent reason to be present. The Phantom case has not yielded that kind of clean modern closure. You can feel the quiet disappointment of that. It is not dramatic. It is the disappointment of opening a box and finding that time has done what time does. The paper is there, perhaps. The clippings are there. Some photographs are there. But the one small sealed trace that might speak in a modern laboratory is absent, or uncertain, or no longer capable of saying what we need it to say. Still, modern review can help even without solving. It can correct myths. It can clarify timelines. It can separate primary records from later embellishment. It can restore names and context. It can show why certain suspects rose and others fell. It can explain the difference between rumor, suspicion, and admissible evidence. In the Phantom case, that work is valuable because the public story has grown so large. You can imagine a modern investigator or historian creating a timeline on a long table. February, March, April, May. Then the later suspect developments, then imprisonment records, then anniversary accounts. Each card is placed in order. The colors are restrained. The handwriting is neat. The work is not exciting in the ordinary sense, but it is deeply calming because the past becomes a little more organized without being forced into false certainty. Organization is one way to care for an unsolved case. It says the confusion will not be allowed to swallow the people involved. It says each date deserves its place. Each witness deserves careful attribution. Each claim deserves a source, even if the final script does not speak those sources aloud. Behind calm narration, there should always be quiet structure. The listener may drift, but the story should not. In the Phantom case, structure begins with the attacks, but it does not end there. It includes the investigation, the suspect focus, the legal obstacles, the rumor climate, the media afterlife, and the long cold case condition. If any one of those is missing, the mystery becomes too simple. With all of them present, you can understand why detectives never reached the ending the town wanted. The legal obstacles deserve one more slow look, because they are often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine that if a wife told police her husband was responsible, the case should be finished, but courts do not operate on emotional force alone. The statement must be admissible, it must be reliable, it must be corroborated. The defense must be able to challenge it. A prosecutor must believe conviction is possible and just. Marital privilege, especially as understood at the time, could prevent or limit testimony between spouses, even if the exact legal posture was complex. The practical effect in the Phantom case was that Peggy Swinney's reported statements did not become the courtroom key investigators needed. You can feel how maddening that must have been. A door seemed visible, and the law said the door could not be used in the way people hoped. Yet the law's caution has reasons. Spouses may speak under pressure. They may recant. They may be influenced by fear, anger, loyalty, coercion, or self-protection. A court must ask whether the statement can be tested. If a statement cannot be tested properly, it may be powerful in an investigator's mind and still dangerous as the foundation for conviction. The Phantom case sits exactly in that discomfort. You can imagine Peggy herself as more than a legal problem. She was a young woman in a difficult position, bound to a man under suspicion, and pulled into a case that frightened the town. Whatever she said, whatever she later did or did not say, her role was not simple. The file may use her as a source, but we can remember that sources are people, and people are rarely as flat as documents make them seem. If she feared Swinney, that fear matters. If she felt pressure from officers, that matters too. If she changed her story, that matters. If she gave details investigators believed, that matters. The difficulty is that all of these things can matter at once. A careful reading does not choose the easiest emotional version. It allows complexity to remain. The Phantom case contains many such complex people: survivors, suspects, officers, reporters, families, and citizens all acted under pressures we can only partly reconstruct. Sleep narration does not need to simplify them. It can let them move slowly through the room, each carrying their own portion of uncertainty. That slowness is not weakness. It is respect. You turn another page. The light has shifted in the imagined room, or perhaps your eyes have simply grown used to it. The file still has more to offer, not as revelation, but as texture. A note about a suspect cleared, a clipping about patrols, a later interview, a researcher's correction to an earlier claim. Each small item teaches the same lesson in a different key. The Phantom case stayed unsolved because every promising path narrowed before it reached proof. And when a promising path narrows, the detective has to decide whether to keep crawling or step back and look for another opening. That decision is rarely obvious. If he leaves too soon, he may miss the answer. If he stays too long, he may neglect another lead. In 1946, with public fear around him, every such decision carried weight. The file we read now is the residue of those choices. We can sit with those choices without needing to judge every one. Some may have been wise. Some may have been flawed. Some cannot be understood because the context is gone. The important thing is to see that the investigation was a human system, not a machine. It depended on sleep, weather, memory, law, pride, compassion, communication, and chance. Chance is often the quietest factor in unsolved cases. A person looks out a window or does not. A patrol car turns left or right. Rain falls before a track is cast. A suspect is arrested for another offense before he can be questioned properly, or not arrested soon enough. A witness moves away before realizing what they saw. Detectives can reduce dependence on chance, but they cannot eliminate it. The Phantom case may have turned on chance more than once. A clearer glimpse, a preserved trace, a usable statement, a better timed patrol. Any of these might have changed the result. But chance did not arrange itself that way. It left investigators with fragments. They worked the fragments, and the fragments did not become a whole. There is a kind of peace in recognizing that, not because the outcome is acceptable, but because blame alone is too simple. The Phantom case did not remain unsolved for one reason. It remained unsolved through a convergence of limits. The limits of sight, science, law, records, memory, jurisdiction, and time. Each limit was survivable alone. Together, they made the case extraordinarily difficult to crack. As you let that convergence settle, the old file becomes less like a locked cabinet and more like a weathered landscape. There are roads through it, but some end at washed-out bridges. There are markers, but some have faded. There are voices, but some are distant. You can walk it carefully and learn much, while still never reaching the place where the answer stands openly in daylight. The Phantom case remains officially unsolved, and it is still open to this day. No one was ever convicted for the attacks, and whatever certainty once seemed close has slowly receded into the distance, leaving behind theories, names, suspicions, and unanswered questions, but not the kind of proof that can close a file with confidence. And so you come to the end of it gently, not with a final revelation, but with an honest stillness. The story does not turn, at the last moment, into something neat. It stays what it has been all along, a shadow moving at the edge of a small city's memory, carried forward by reports, recollections, newspaper ink, courthouse records, and the quiet persistence of people who wanted the truth to be known. You can imagine the roads now after midnight, less as scenes of fear and more as places that returned, eventually, to ordinary life. Cars passed over them again. Porches were swept. Storefronts opened. Children grew older. the seasons kept changing over Texarkana, laying heat, rain, dust, and leaves over the same ground where fear had once gathered so heavily. That does not erase what happened. It only reminds you that even the darkest stories are held inside a larger world, one that keeps breathing after the sirens fade, after the headlines yellow, after the names become history. The victims were real people, not symbols, and the absence of an answer does not make their lives less vivid or their losses less deserving of care. What remains then is a kind of quiet responsibility, to remember without inventing certainty, to wonder without turning pain into spectacle, to accept that some doors stay partly closed, even when many hands have tried the lock, and as the night settles around this unfinished case, you can let the unanswered parts rest where they are, not solved, not forgotten, but set down softly for now, in the dark, where the past is still, and the mind can finally grow quiet.